Greetings, friends. In this video, I'm going to talk about my unusual experiences hanging out in a particular graveyard in Africa on multiple occasions. I did tell this story before, but that was 6 months ago when this channel was brand new. So if you're one of my faithful subscribers who's heard this story before, please excuse me. But I did reorganize my thoughts, so you can think of this as a new and improved edition of that story. I enjoy all things about the paranormal, and this is some of the best first-hand material I can offer to the discourse. But the other aspect of this video is just ethnography and describing the situation I was in. First, let me offer some thoughts on graveyards in general. I like North American cemeteries because they strike a good balance between human structure and nature. They're like gardens, partly manicured and partly growing freely. Some Latin American cemeteries, on the other hand, for example, like, I don't remember the name, but a very famous cemetery in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, these cemeteries have no nature at all. Everything is concrete and stone and metal. There's plenty of statues and ornamentation, but literally no earth or plants. Everything feels so cold and heavy, it's very macabre, like being in a mausoleum. On the other hand, cemeteries in Africa are the opposite. They're all nature and no manicure. Nature swallows everything, and it even erases the graves themselves. This is the context I found myself in Ghana. So why did I spend time in a graveyard in Ghana? Well, to smoke weed. Because, weed is still taboo around the world, so people do the same thing in North America, don't they? You go to the graveyard, and being in a country town, the location of the cemetery is on the edge of town. That would be normal. So it's got the bush, the open, forest on one side of it. So it's away from prying eyes. I mean, many Ghanaians smoke weed too, and but it's something it's still against the law. So it's not something you really want other people to know you're doing. There's a lot of bad mind people, Babylon, all that stuff. You gotta be, a few steps ahead of people. And why not go to the cemetery? It's a really nice place, as I'll get into that. So, like I said, it's located on the edge of town. When was this? Well, 2010, 2011, and then again in 2015. I don't really remember how many times, but more often than the old days. Before I got into building a house and all this other stuff. So that was the practical reason for me to be there. Now, how did we enter and leave this? We being my friend, Blinksman, and sometimes we'd have some other Ghanaians with us. And what if it's just Blinksman and me, the only person I trust really, we would always have to enter in kind of a roundabout way. Like we'd go walking on a path through, the neighborhood, through a very, the people on the edge of town, it's not very organized. They literally might be living in a mud house, and so you take one of those trails in, or you drive in and park, but you don't park right by the cemetery. You park some distance away. So you're always scanning around, make sure no one has their eyes on you. And then you go in. And sometimes when we would pass through a certain path, we would have to go through the property of this humble family, and they were pretty poor, and so we would give them I had these cigarettes, and I didn't always smoke, but I brought these cigarettes from Canada, and then the cigarettes are more high quality in North America than what's available in Ghana. So I would be giving these like menthol cigarettes, and that was like he really appreciate that, and so that was something that was kind of like that. And then in return for that, it's like we can continue into the cemetery through their path, and so it's underground. This is what being underground is all about. No pun intended, because I'll be discussing underground in a different way. But yeah. So this is sort of the context here, and of course there were grave diggers normally working in the cemetery. There were maybe 2 or 3 men. And the sort of person who is a grave digger is, I don't know, maybe they're similar all around the world, but they're generally, from what I experienced, laid back people, and they like to smoke weed themselves. And so they were totally cool with us being there, and sometimes they'd even smoke weed with us. and then they go back to like digging graves. We would pay them a little some small money here and there, because not, you know, they're permitting us to be there, and they're also serve as a lookout if anyone's coming. So we're on good terms with everyone there. And what was it like hanging out in this cemetery? Well, it was a really peaceful place, tranquil, beautiful, and also really eerie. Something a little unsettling about it. I mean, I guess many people would get that feeling in cemeteries when you're close to the dead. But this is a little different. Like I said, I talked about North American cemeteries. It's a bit different. It's a bit more eerie. Like a Latin American city is pretty eerie too, pretty macabre. But this is in a different way. There's because of the nature reclaiming the graves and reclaiming everything, the unruly nature of it. So there's all these, I believe they're called forget-me-not trees, and they basically form a canopy. This is normal in cemeteries in Ghana, maybe in other West African countries, and they're a very beautiful tree because they flower all the time with different colored flowers. In this case, it was like these yellow flowers that would come down and form a carpet of flowers and these dried leaves. So there wouldn't really be any undergrowth, but just these trees. And those trees are really nice. Like I said, they form a canopy, but the vegetation, like I said, it does tend to claim some of these graves. And there's with the proximity to the bush and the forest on one side of the graveyard, there's more of a need to be careful. You need to be aware of snakes, because snakes are poisonous, and also ants. Ants, like just don't step on a trail of ants, or if you leave the ants alone, then they'll leave you alone. So a lot of these graves were sarcophagi, above ground sarcophagi, and then there's the other graves, conventional graves, where you're just buried in the ground, and then there's like a tombstone. But I'd say about half the graves there, well, maybe a third of them were sarcophagi. So you can sit on the sarcophagi, use them as benches when you're smoking there. And I mean, on my own, I would never be in a cemetery, by myself, and I would naturally not want to sit on a person's grave. That would be disrespectful in my culture. But going along with the Ghanaian flow, they're like, no, this is fine. This is what we do. So this is being a participant, anthropological, participant observation. I mean, come on, the dead are dead, and now we can, at least they're with nature, and you can sit on their graves, and I mean, it's like they're forgotten anyways, so in some way, we're recognizing them more than anyone else does. I mean, it doesn't look, these graves are unmaintained, and like I said, there's the nature reclaims a lot of this stuff. Many of the marked graves where you can read and you can sometimes see a photograph, there are of these young people. So there is a bit of a sad aspect to this graveyard. And you notice, a lot of these people are younger than me or the same age as me, and they've been dead for so many years. And you start to wonder, what happened to them? So along with these, more solid graves like the sarcophagi and more proper tombstones, there are a lot of unmarked graves. It's almost like more than a third, or maybe like 35% of the, I'm just guessing, I don't know, but there's a lot of unmarked graves because you just see these bumps of earth, and that's it, right? Maybe there was a tombstone at some point, but there's one thing to have a marker, okay? Sometimes there's markers, but those are tiny. So why are so many graves unmarked? Because a lot of people are poor. So it costs money to have a sarcophagus and even a proper tombstone. A lot of people are poor, so they can't afford these things. And a few times, not very often, I did observe a burial going on. And obviously, when a burial is happening, it would always be on the weekend, I believe on a Saturday. And the whole procession from town moves to the cemetery with the body, and I guess a pastor, and they there's a bunch of wailing. That's the main thing I remember. Not really observing this up close, but from a distance you can hear the wailing. And of course, if we were smoking, we would obviously move away. We'd go into the bush, away from the actual cemetery. But then, coming in the wind, there'd be this wailing, this really disturbing wailing. It sounds really ghost-like. it's just women. It's just children and women. That's all it is. But it's kind of creepy. And then, of course, the last thing I'd say about what it was like to be there is it's strictly only a place to be during the day. My Ghanaian associates, my friend, they were very clear about, like, okay, it's one thing if the sun is going down, but if it's already nightfall, then it's time to be out of the cemetery. That's just, I didn't ask further about that, but I mean, besides snakes and all sorts of other things, there's a spiritual reason. There's good reasons not to want to be in a graveyard, at least this graveyard, after dark. It could be really dangerous for you. Who knows what could be lurking? So I mentioned a bit about the character of the grave diggers. They were kind of laid back. And speaking of these burials, this one time when we were hanging out in the bush, a bit away from the actual grave, like into the actual bush, and I got a chance to ask them, like, so, have you seen ghosts? Do you have any ghost stories? And oh yeah, they all did. They were all believers in this sort of thing, based on their personal experience. And fine. They had several things to say, but let's stick to the ghosts. Basically, the only thing that I could gather that they would experience on multiple occasions is that after a burial, when everyone else has gone home, and it all remains is the body and the gravedigger to bury the dead body, and then so they bury the body, and they're maybe sitting around, relaxing after doing the labor, quiet place, no one's around here, and that's when the apparition occurs, and it's a figure dressed in white, and they're alone. And they're staring at the grave for a few moments, just looking at the grave, and then vanishing. So that's something they reported to me. I mean, that's something they said happened on multiple occasions. They also talked about, like, we asked them we were like, what other sorts of fucked up shit happens here? And they were like, well, I mean, sometimes they'll be digging a new grave. They'll be preparing the earth. They'll be getting a few feet down, and a terrible smell will come out of the earth. And yep, they've accidentally exhumed a body. And of course, at that point, stop what you're doing. Don't dig there anymore. So that does happen. And they mentioned during one burial, we learned that, I mean, this isn't a paranormal thing. This is just a really gross thing. They had to bury this. And this is not funny, well, unless you have a really macabre sense of humor. But some man in town apparently died in his house alone, and he was in his house. The body was in the house for like more than 5 days, maybe like a little less than a week before it was discovered. Can you imagine, like, having to take that body out of the house and then having to be the gravedigger, like, putting that thing under? I mean, this is a tropical country with, like, weather that can hover around 30 degrees Celsius. So can you imagine, like, what sort of decomposition would occur in even like 48 hours? Now, moving on, there is this presence of bones in the cemetery. I didn't see too many bones, but there were human bones around. And the one thing that sticks out in my memory the most is this mandible. The mandible is the jawbone, the lower part, that you rip, it's the part that detaches, right? And maybe 10 feet out of the actual grounds of the cemetery, in the trees, in the shadows, there was this tree there, and it's like a V, right, with a crook right in the middle of this. tree, and then that's where the mandible was placed, right? So someone had come into the cemetery, had taken this mandible, and had put it in a specific location in the crook of this tree. And I saw that mandible there. I saw the bright white teeth, glistening. You can see that there, just there. Can you imagine if this was like, if you saw something like this in North America? In Africa, it's like, that's, yes. My friends told me, yes, that is a human jawbone. And I said, well, what's going on here? What are they doing? And they said, well, that's juju. Juju is, that's black magic, that's witchcraft. And they said, well, someone from town has obviously taken that bone and they placed it there for ritual purposes, right? And they're going to be coming back, probably maybe at night, and they're going to be conducting some ritual. They're going to be having some interaction with that bone to get something. They do this black magic. You're always trying to get something out of it, right? So that's the juju, and that's my experience in the cemetery. Just to conclude this video, let me just take a tiny move away from the specific subject of cemeteries and towards the question of how else witchcraft manifests in Africa, how else juju can manifest. So I'll discuss 3 specific stories because it's a huge topic and there's too many different things to talk about. But my friend Blinksman, one of his clear examples of juju is he was cursed by a witch, but he'd been protected, so it couldn't affect him. But whatever they did, it caused his shirt to spontaneously combust. So yeah, the skeptic is going to laugh at that. But this is my good friend. I've known him many years, and there's no way he's making this up. So unless you think he's hallucinating, yeah, he's like, yeah, my shirt spontaneously combusted, and he was able to rip it off. You see, the thing is, it was supposed to be him combusting. It was supposed to be him, but because he'd been protected when he was an infant, he was bathed in a certain river for spiritual protection. The energy didn't affect him, and what would happen theoretically, but what they say is that'll go straight back to the person that created that bad energy, and they might even end up burning themselves, figuratively or literally, I don't know. When I was in Tanzania, which admittedly is far from Ghana, I did know this young man named Tuma, and when I asked him about witchcraft with a very straight face, he was like, well, one of the reasons he believes in witchcraft is because, in his words, a witch killed his father. And some woman in town was shouting at his father, and well, his father was shouting at her, and they were cursing each other. But then basically she uttered some curse at him, and a few hours later he just coughing blood, and dead that night. And of course you could explain that away. But I'm just trying to say this is how it manifests. This is one of the ways. This is a very real subject. The last thing to conclude this video is the concept of blood money, which I know from Ghana. And blood money is basically a blood sacrifice. You get blood, preferably from a human victim, maybe from an animal, and you offer it to the devil or to some spirit. And many young men, especially in Accra, in the big city, who don't have any idea how to get ahead, they get caught up in this blood money, and apparently it's they can get anything out of it. They can get a sports car, money coming right out of a box, an empty box. You open it up, it's filled with money. I know it would sound ridiculous, but I don't know. Psychologically, there's something going on here. These people are not trying to lie. They're quite serious. So again, you may not consider this all, rational evidence, but it's think of it at least as ethnography, and maybe you found that entertaining or educational. Hope you enjoyed that. That's all I have to say for now. Hasta luego, amigo.